interested in ancient mysteries and lost things from a very, very young age again, right? It's something that was always speaking to me. And then there was certain things in my life that came that really put me on that path. And I ended up going down a road that I had never imagined. And I feel very, very lucky to be able to do this as my career full time. And to be able to do what you truly love, that you're most passionate about, is the greatest gift you could ever imagine. So I feel very, very lucky to be able to do this. And so this presentation is going to be quite a journey. This is going to take you all over the world, but specifically linking some very core areas that I believe are part of understanding who we are. Like, what is our story? Is our story what a lot of traditional science and archaeology says, where we were simply nomadic hunter-gatherers, and then all of a sudden one day civilizations rose up, 6,000 years ago, and the whole story can be put in this nice, neat little box? No. We have a much more complex story than we've been told. And if that is coming out all the time, people like Robert Edward Grant and many, many others are helping to illuminate this lost time period of who we really are. Because in order to go forward in the future, we have to first understand where we've been. And this presentation is truly going to go through and connect, I guess what you would call the rabbit hole of this entire chapter of us that many of us have largely forgotten, and that we're trying to remember now. Remember, it's not just about learning something new, it's about this remembrance journey. And that's what I hope to take you on today. So how do I change slides? Okay. So this first slide is just a couple quick examples to lay out a framework, a foundation for where we're about to go. And I wanted to start by showing you some unbelievable comparisons to 3 different locations, one of which we're going to be visiting on this trip, and multiple, but it starts out with this very strange connection to eastern Turkey, this area of Lake Van that is actually very, very unknown by most of the world. And the reason for that is that a lot of these sites you're seeing at the top of the screen have just been found or are just being excavated, and it's something that is far newer than things like Göbekli Tepe and others. Most of the world is completely unaware of what is going on around Lake Van. Lake Van is an area that used to be ancient Armenia, in the Ararat area of Armenia. Now it's eastern Turkey. Now that area, in my opinion, will be a pivotal point of us understanding who we once were. And so this presentation will help connect that entire lost story. But I wanted to give you just some quick comparisons. Top left hand of the screen is a place called Cavustepe. And this is a basalt column that is 7 to 10 tons, okay? And the first thing that people often say when I show these different sites is they say, wait a minute, is that South America? That looks just like Bumapunku or Tiwanaku, right? And it's like, no, actually it's thousands and thousands of miles away in eastern Turkey. And again, the second image, Ionis Kalesi, you look at these giant basalt blocks and they look very similar to Tiwanaku, Bumapunku, and Bolivia. And at the top of the screen, you can see this step pyramid design circled in the top right that has the same design as right here in Peru, where we're going to go visit Ollantay Tambo, Baño de Nusta. Now this is just to give you a quick overview of some of the similarities that we can see around the world, and I will now take you on a journey to understand how these are all connected and how it's part of a mystery related to teachings. Now those teachings weren't left to us in ancient Sanskrit or scrolls or papyrus or even cuneiform. They were left to us in a completely different way. Is anybody a Manly P. Hall fan in here? Okay, Manly P. Hall has, paraphrased a quote from his work. He basically says that when humanity understands the language of symbolism, a great veil will be lifted. Because ancient civilizations, these mystic teachings, right? These great sages, they believed that the knowledge that they were lowering was so profound that in order for it to be understood, you had to know how to understand and read it. But that meant that the average person couldn't just pick something up or look at something and just get these secrets, because it wasn't meant for them yet. And so the beauty of symbolism is that you can have complex narratives and teachings woven into motifs and symbols that can speak to very, very deep, profound things, but to the person who's not an adept, the person who's not understanding some of these mysteries, it won't really make any sense to them. It's a way that the ancients believed that they could preserve these teachings for those who were ready to understand them. And those who weren't, they simply wouldn't see it. And that's the beauty of like what Robert was saying, is that you have to get to the certain frequency, right? You have to have this certain vibration and this connection to say, oh my God, I completely understand. Like, that's mind-blowing, right? And to the other person, they may look at it and it looks like nothing. But that's the beauty of what the ancients left behind. So the first place I want to start is, here we are in Peru, right? And that's where this area of eastern Turkey is, right? Asia Minor, thousands and thousands of miles away. How could we have the same symbols, the same motifs, the same building styles, the same stonework, and even the same types of stone that these civilizations were deciding to do all the way across the world? And this is a story that's going to connect to what we can think of as the lost civilizations of our history. A time when we were very different than, well, perhaps not this group, but humanity as a whole, right? We used to be much more connected to spirit, much more connected to the earth, understanding that we're part of the universe. And they understood all of that. And we're finding our way back. And so this is the place we want to start, is understanding that these two locations and everything in between is all connected. So the first place I want to start is, this journey began for me because I had an extreme interest in ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Sumer, right? The origins of mathematics, astronomy, agriculture, animal husbandry, basically the foundations and building blocks of civilization itself. But it was so mysterious because the Sumerians seemed to just emerge out of nowhere. And the knowledge that they had seemingly came out of nowhere. And it was a mystery on how all of these things happened and what they left behind. And as I studied closer and closer, I ended up realizing that there was this lost connection, something that we were going to explore deeper, that connects all the way back to the very beginning, right? Everything is based on cycles that are in a circle. Time is not linear. Time actually follows loops and circles. Its cycles govern everything in the universe. Now, as you can see, so this is what's called the famous mural out of the Ashurbanipal Library. And this was discovered in 1849 in what's today Mosul, Iraq. And this is from an ancient library called the Ashurbanipal Library. And in the center, you can see the tree of life with 7 spokes in the center, okay? Relating to this higher spirit and consciousness and life force of everything. And there's this connection that was once understood between passing the pine cones, seeds of knowledge of everything. Imagine learning about the very fundamental understanding of not only the balance of Earth and our consciousness and our spirit here, but understanding our place in the universe. And as I started to study this, I saw the very same similarities. The bottom right is what's called the Kef bas-relief. It's a giant basalt bas-relief that is 3 feet by 3 feet by 4 feet, massive. And that was found in 1964 in this place called Ionis Kalesi. And the most wild thing about that story is that when they discovered that, and that's a whole road that you can go down in a separate place, but that was left in a garden in front of the old Museum of Vaughan for 25 years. Sitting in a garden outside in the rain and the snow, and nobody cared about it. And it sat there and eventually was moved to the Ankara Museum, the Anatolian Museum, where it received very little attention because archaeologists had considered it a primitive Urartian artifact that had very little significance to anything in history. And that's where our mystery starts. Because those same symbols, whether it's the tree of life in the center, and you'll be able to see a larger version of this as we go forward, or the passing of the pine cone, right? And what he's also holding in his hand is the sacred chalice, or the cup. And we are going to be unlocking some of the greatest mysteries that go all the way and connect to even things like the Knights Templar, and all the way up to the great power of the Christian church and others, where this has been known for a very, very long time. So, excuse me. What you're seeing in front of you, is anyone ever heard of the Sumerian king list? Okay. So the Sumerian king list is this very mysterious cuneiform tablet. And it's one of many that have come out of this ancient Mesopotamian region. And it was found in the very same place that last mural was found, in this huge library. And it basically states that there were 5 original cities created and lowered here. Not just this random thing where people got together and they're like, hey, this is a good spot, let's build something here. Nothing like that. It describes these pure divine places of energy in which 5 original cities were created. The last of those cities was called Shuruppak. And Shuruppak became a great enigma for me because it was considered previously a myth. Archaeologists and historians had considered these stories merely allegory, and they were myths, they weren't real. However, in 1931, Shuruppak was found by archaeologists, and it was a very quiet discovery that I ended up stumbling upon the archaeological papers from that, and it led to this whole story, this lost story, about where we came from and where we went, and what happened along that way. Now, this list right here, what it connects to is this ancient story that Christianity turned into what became known as Noah. Okay? The Noah story was originally based on the original Sumerian and Babylonian version, and in the Assyrian and Akkadian versions of this story related to the son of Urartian. Urartian was the last great king and ruler of this city of Shuruppak before it was destroyed. Now his son was named Utnapishtim or Zayasudra, and he became the figure we think of as Noah. But the story of Noah is very different than the Christian and Hebrew versions that were often taught. And that's what we're going to be going down. It was about this preservation of a group who became some of the greatest sages that the world has ever known. Okay, so here's the connections that I want to go through, and you're going to see how this all leads to everything around. It's part of a great story, and it leads all the way to Peru and Bolivia. So in the Atrahasis Epic of Gilgamesh tablets, you find this story of a great Sumerian king and priest. Now, Urartian was technically not the last ruler of Shuruppak. If you read the Sumerian king list in the actual index, you find out that his son ended up ruling for a very short amount of time before everything was destroyed. And again, I just mentioned his name of Utnapishtim or Zayasudra. And in that story, you find the very basis of nearly every story from Genesis and Abrahamic religions that had its origin, though, in ancient Mesopotamia. And it has direct connections back to our story and our lost civilization story. Now, again, you can see right here the successor in circle, and circled over there on the right, called Zayasudra. So Zayasudra was a great, great priest, sage, and a king. He was a very wise man. In fact, the name of his tablets, called the Atrahasis, means very wise or exceedingly wise. And he basically was the great ancestor of the mystical teachings and sages that we see around the world. So, again, like I mentioned previously, this ancient city of Shuruppak was considered merely a myth for nearly 50 to 60 years when it was first discussed and uncovered. In 1931, archaeologists went to a place called Farah, Iraq, and there they uncovered what was first myth and legend and turned into reality. And they discovered there something that may change all of histories we know in the future. And I mean that. It's a very, very significant discovery because of how it was discovered. So these are actual photographs from that excavation, and you'll see where I'm going here as I go along, because how are we going to prove that lost civilizations existed? How are we going to prove the story of where we came from and what we endured, and how the whole thing weaves into this understanding of where we are now? So this is the original images from 1931, and this is what the modern city of Tel Farah, it's called, looked like today, right? So they were there, and it was interesting because if Shuruppak was supposed to be a myth, then why were archaeologists looking for it? It's a very interesting story that's woven in there. I just like to show this image because the actual report is quite intriguing to read, because when they were about to start excavating, they got hit by a 2-day sandstorm that completely almost destroyed the entire excavation, and they had to take cover for 2 days. And this is an actual image of that sandstorm rolling in across the great deserts of Iraq. Basically, they described it as a wall of sand that engulfed them for 2 days, followed by cloudbursts of thunderstorms at night. Basically, it was interesting how all these events seemed to happen right before they were about to uncover a great, great secret. So I want to show this and just explain it, and you'll understand where this is all going in a minute, because we have to start from the beginning. So this is the very top level where you saw those camps called Tel Farah. Now, as they start digging down, they found 3 different civilizations that had been in that region. Now, as many of you probably know, civilizations around the world built on the very same spots that other civilizations had been before. And the confusion is what the original civilization was that had been there. And as you can see here, they go down, and at 6 feet down, they encounter what they call stratum 2 layer. And stratum 2 layer is the period we would think of as the Gilgamesh time, the time of Uruk, okay? And Gilgamesh was a great king of the city of Uruk, and he is the reason why tablets like the Epic of Gilgamesh exist. Now, those stories, if you have ever read it, tie into this ancient narrative of Gilgamesh trying to seek out Zayasudra. And we'll get there in a minute, but that's where Gilgamesh's story resides. It resides right in here. Okay? They found ancient tablets and jars and other things. Now, when they went just below what they called stratum 2, this layer, they figured that the story that what they were looking for was over. And it's very interesting that if you read the report, 70% of the entire excavation team left, because right below stratum 2, they hit this giant alluvial layer, meaning flood layer, that had no evidence of human remains and no evidence of civilization at all. And they thought, okay, well, the narrative we're taught ends there. And so 70% of the entire team leaves the excavation, leaving only a fraction of the archaeologists and some of the workers to keep digging and continue. Well, this alluvial layer, this flood layer, ended up being 4 feet thick. 4 feet of no evidence of human remains or activity. And as they kept digging, they hit something very, very important. At 13 to 16 feet down, they hit a whole entire other civilization they called stratum 1. And stratum 1, they figured out by finding tablets, they confirmed that it was this once mythical city of Shuruppak, something that was so old that you'll see that it's part of a narrative that's far older than 6,000 years old. Now, despite the fact that we're told that the Sumerians existed at 6,000 years ago, I believe what we're uncovering is a lost chapter of human history in which what we're thinking of the Sumerians is actually cultures like the Akkadians and Assyrians that came far later. And that there's an earlier version of this whole story that they discovered. And they discovered it 13 to 16 feet. Here's an example of the entire stratum, just so you can get an understanding of how massively deep we're talking about. The layer that, as you went down below stratum 1, it goes all the way down to 20 feet down. And again, they find all this remains of a civilization there, and they confirm that it's the city of Shuruppak. And in that city, they discovered that the remains at the bottom there were very mysterious. The people had fled rapidly and taken many of their belongings. It was like they almost described it as like chaotic in the scene. Well, this is what led me towards an understanding that changed. Because if you, first question you ask yourself was you say, okay, so Shuruppak was real. That story was real. There was an antediluvian civilization called the Sumerians that were very, very ancient. And there was a king named Ziusudra who was literally based on the Noah story that had this entire experience where he had to essentially survive what was in that region like the end of the world. It was described as a massive deluge that wiped out that region. Now, what was really funny, actually go back to the last previous slide. What was really interesting about this is that archaeologists, when they had written down the conclusions about this site, they wrote this entire section at the end of the archaeological paper. And it states that they can't help but see the comparisons of the stories from the Atrahasis and Epic of Gilgamesh of this great city that had a flood go through and destroyed it, and then basically the progenitors ended up in another region of the world. But the thing that was funny about that is they made so many comparisons to how that story drew parallels to the huge flood layer with this civilization right underneath it, right? Just like what the stories say. But they go on to say that they're simply it was simply words of play on thought, and that they were not actually admitting or stating that civilization had ever existed like the stories say. So they end up backtracking their statements, and they basically said, well, it's very interesting, but it still isn't a real story. And that's where I take that story to the next level, because we know that it was real. But if we know that Shuruppak was real, and we know that this king, Utnapishtim Ziusudra, was real, then what else is real? This is where it's going to unfold us into a whole journey. Because in the Atrahasis, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, in the Eridu Genesis, in the legend of Itzubar, in other ancient tablets, they all tell about this story. And what they say is that the last king of Shuruppak was warned by his patron god Enki, and we will see comparisons of Enki in other places as well, is this god of knowledge and preservation, who warned him secretly of a pact that had existed with the gods to destroy humanity. And then it's described that he was told to create a massive craft, a boat, out of cedar and bitumen to seal off and bring his family and animals, that's how it's described, to basically survive this massive event that ends up happening. And he's sworn to not tell anyone, okay? So he ends up getting on this craft. It's described as this massive boat. And this event sweeps through the land, and it describes it as a massive deluge with darkness engulfing everything, basically sweeping over the land. And the story ends up with landing. If you guys remember, right, the Noah Christian story is he lands in the Ararat Mountains of eastern Turkey, of what was of Armenia. Now, I sat with this for probably 10 years. Couldn't figure out where to go. Didn't seem to be any evidence of anything happening there. It's like the tablets ended with him landing in the Ararat Mountains, and then the gods of Enki and Enlil come down, and they're in basically an argument over if humanity should continue or not. And basically what ends up out of it is that Enlil says, well, Zaya Sudra, you have preserved what he says is the seed of mankind. And so he ends up granting him immortality. That's what it states. But he's the last man that's it's stated to ever get immortality, ever again. And that after that, humans are all mortal. Well, Zaya Sudra had 3 sons. You may have heard of them, right? Japheth, Shem, and Ham. It's very well known throughout Hebrew and Christian traditions. But that was where this story was stuck. Right? I was stuck with it for 10 years until I stumbled on to this region of Lake Vaughn. Now, Lake Vaughn is to the west of Mount Ararat. And what has been emerging there since largely getting into the public view since early 2000s, even discoveries as recent as 2017, have completely changed this narrative. So here's Lake Vaughn and the mountains surrounding it. It is a beautiful, beautiful lake, and it has an ancient history. Great rulers and leaders like Alexander the Great and Xerxes and others have gone to this region and left inscriptions and other things because I think they knew something very special was in this region. Something that connects all the way back to our story. So I want to start out with this unbelievable discovery that some of you may know of, but many of you probably haven't heard of. It's one of the newest archaeological discoveries in the world. And it's very little attention and very few people have heard of it. Under Lake Vaughn is a set of megalithic ruins, the only megalithic ruins, large stone blocks in the world underwater. Now there are underwater areas like off of Greece and off of Egypt that have like steles and others. First of all, they're very shallow, but they're not complex megalithic walls. They're more primitive walls, and there are other types of structures that don't have the same characteristics. Now, what kind of characteristics are we looking for? This chapter of human civilization that we're calling the lost civilizations, the telltale evidence around the world seems to be this absolutely stunningly sophisticated type of stonework that is, even today, blows our mind with how it was possible, right? Robert showed yesterday in the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber. Those granite blocks in the King's Chamber are so finely cut, but also some of them are over 20 to 50 tons up on top of the ceiling. We have no idea how they did that. No idea how they moved those stones, how they cut those stones or lifted them and put them into place. That is the very same thing like the Valley Temple of Egypt, or what we're about to go to today, Saskatchewan and Cusco, right? And Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and Pumapunku. It's the same type of telltale sign that we look for. And this is actually very important for us to understand, because when we're in the field and we're looking at these things, it's this leftover key. It's a key to their civilizations, because they could do things with stone that we can't even do today, or I would have trouble with today. Now, again, let's go back to 2017. 75 feet under Lake Vaughn, they find a city that has ruins over the length of an entire kilometer. A massive set of megalithic ruins that are baffling and mysterious. Again, 75 feet underwater. How could that even happen? Well, that's a whole story in itself, and it's part of a whole team of experts, which includes Robert Everett Graham, by the way, which we are going to that region, and we've been doing scouting trips, and we're going to be filming a documentary to explore this mystery. So there's a lot more being done on this as we go forward. What I'll at least lay out the story for us to understand is that this whole set of ruins in this part of the region is a story that connects to the story that I told you with Zaya Sudra. And that's what's so important about it. Okay, now here is Lake Vaughn, and this is where the underwater ruins were I just showed you, off of a town called the Chichibes. And I wanted to highlight and circle 3 other areas that we're going to be looking at. Now, there are more than this in that region, But these are some of the most important that I think are going to blow your mind, because the world literally doesn't know about this yet. It's brand new. It's the new kid in the block, if you want to call it, in the archaeological world. So the first site I want to talk about, and some of you have probably seen this online. It's shown in a lot of social media, this site, and a lot of people confuse it with South American ruins. And this is what's called Cavustepe. Now these blocks are basalt. It's volcanic stone, and you're going to see a lot of comparisons with basalt even here. A lot of the megalithic blocks in Cusco and others are basalt. Seemed a very, very important stone that was to these ancient cultures, highly magnetic, a lot of magnetite, very, very hard. It's one of the hardest stones in the world, so it can last the test of time. Now, the story of Cavustepe is very interesting because it's also known as Hykaberg, okay? Now, Hykaberg is named after the founder of the Armenian nation called King Haik. Now, if you go to Armenia, everybody there knows King Haik. King Haik is their great founder, and there's statues built of King Haik. Now, it gets very interesting that I stumbled across when I was doing this research is not only the megaliths, right? Spectacular megaliths, some of the finest in the world. Multi-ton blocks cut so fine that you can still feel as sharp as an edge as anywhere you can find a stone in the world in those sites. Now here's the story of King Haik. You learned that King Haik basically was battling ancient Bel in Babylon, and it describes it. This is just in Armenia. You can find this in like ancient chapels and churches. This isn't hidden. It's just right out in the open. And you learn that King Haik is a descendant of Japheth. Okay? So you're like, whoa, wait a minute. So that story was real. Those descendants of Zayasutra were really in this region. And that's where this all unfolds. Now I want to show this for those who, obviously you need to see evidence before you back up bold statements. You can just go on Wikipedia and look up the genealogy of King Haik, and you find at the top right there, he is a great, great descendant of the Noah figure, which we know the Noah figure is Zayasutra because the stories that were left behind in the tablets that predate Christianity and Hebrew traditions by thousands and thousands of years are basically paralleled in Genesis. They're paralleled. And they all describe that as being the Noah figure, and nobody really argues that. Even archaeologists in their papers, when they found Shuruppak and they're giving the conclusions, they even state it's the Noah mythology of the Noah figure. So we know if you could just replace the word Noah up there under Armenian and just put Zayasutra, you can see the direct lineage that continues down. And of course, there's your biblical pro-Georgian and Armenian descriptions. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of these names. We see it throughout history. And again, it's very woven into Hebrew and Christian traditions and Abrahamic traditions. But here you can see something that I feel is very strange that nobody seems to talk about, is that there literally is a direct connection between King Haik as a descendant of Japheth and Noah. So that automatically gets your attention, because the first question is, well, if that story was real, then where did they go? Where did they build? What happened? What kind of knowledge did they have? What did they pass? And this is what I believe is leading down to the road of understanding not just a lost civilization, but the emergence of an entire golden age that started in this region and then passed around the world. So here again, this is the world according to the ancient Hebrew accounts, and you can see here in red, this is the area of Japheth where he traveled to create civilizations. And then you can see the sons of Ham and the sons of Shem. That's right, Egypt, Persia, Europe, everything. What we're looking at for understanding a lost chapter of our history may have been sitting right in front of us the entire time. And this shows us this ancient lineage that once existed between these sons of Zayasutra. Okay, so back to Cavustepe. Remember, Hykaberg, direct descendant. Hike is considered one of the great founders or progenitors of this region. Now, I don't think King Hike built it, but I think he was a ruler that was part of this civilization. Now, I want to point out a couple things. The first thing that's very interesting is you have this incredible dark basalt work, this stonework that is extremely fine and sophisticated. Now, all around it is this primitive limestone. Now, the mountain this is built on, this location, doesn't have any basalt native to it at all. It's only limestone. And so the work that you're seeing all around it came from a completely different civilization, a different culture. Now, they are called the Urartians. Now, the Urartians were a culture that was alive during the Assyrian time period. So when you showed that mural in the very beginning of the Ashurbanipal library, that was named after King Ashurbanipal. And he was an Assyrian king. And that was the same time period that the Urartians were alive. And they were constantly at war. And they were fighting. And that is a big piece of this to understand where we can connect to, because we see completely different building styles from the Urartian civilization that is Iron Age with this highly sophisticated, mysterious civilization that I am calling the Ararat civilization, because they didn't leave a name for themselves, and they considered Ararat their most sacred mountain. Now, why I'm showing you this is that today, archaeologists still firmly believe, that culture that has that limestone work is the very same culture that built that basalt work. And this is a theme that we see all around the world, even here with the Inca, as the Inca being the builders of the incredibly sophisticated megalithic work we see all around this region. However, that seems to be very similar to the story of the Urartians. Not that they were necessarily the same kind of war culture, but that they were a culture that came later that tried to build right on top of existing older structures. Number one, they didn't have access to the same stone or have the ability to even manipulate the stonework. And so the theme we're going to see all through this trip is the Incan mortar, crude stone and mortar work with this highly sophisticated work, and that is exactly mimicked here. Now, I just want to go through this super quickly. It's a little bit of history to understand, but here's the Urartian culture, right? 3,000 years before present, 2800 BC, and they were a war culture. Now, the top right side of the screen contains spearheads. Now, when I show you that Kef Ba relief again, where Haldi is passing the seeds of life, pine cone, archaeologists believe that it was a spearhead, which is completely ridiculous if you consider that it's coming from the tree of life and it mimics all these other things. And so the lens of archaeology here has failed us. And it's time for us to take this into our own hands, and this is basically my crusade, is to set the story straight for us and how unbelievably incredible our story is and what we've done, and to not give credit to later war cultures that are being falsely credited with building these things. Now, here's a site called Ionis, and I just want to show a couple little examples. This is what Urartian stonework looks like. It's a crude type of stone cut in irregular pieces, and when we go to the Coricancha, there's a street right along it that has the edge of the Coricancha building with an incredibly fine stonework, and I want you to all remember this because you're going to see this. It's the best example we have here. It shows incredible fine megalithic stonework, and on the opposite side of the street, has anybody seen this yet? On the opposite side of the street is this primitive, crude Incan stonework on the other side. And those examples are mimicked here exactly. And you see there's two building styles the Urartians had that's almost identical to Inca. They had a type of mud brick design, and then they had a type of crude stonework design. And that's just what we're looking at here, the capabilities that they had, just like the Inca. Now, here is a great shot that really highlights those differences. And again, you're going to see those exact parallels here in Peru. Here, again, you can see, now I want to point out This is not actually dirt. If you look very closely, you can see it is heavily eroded mud brick. And mud brick does not last very long. I mean, very long in comparison to the stone underneath. It'll last a couple thousand years, but not in comparison to the finely cut stonework. Doesn't that look like the unbelievable megaliths that we see right here in Cusco? Right along the Coricancha, the type of stonework is identical. It's identical. Now, the only difference I will say is that it seems that this mysterious civilization here that we're calling the pre-Inca, because it's not the Inca. In fact, we don't even have a name for them. This civilization here, they even brought this level of sophistication to the next degree. When we're going to Saskatchewan today, they were able to take these stones and create some that are over 100 tons. Okay, now these stone blocks you're seeing are around a ton each. So they still had an unbelievably fine craftsmanship and stonework, but when we're in here in Peru, when we're traveling around this region, you'll see that it's even bigger. Now, again, does that look like the same building style on both of those sides, like we see the top and the bottom? It's not, and that's why we need to set this story straight. Here, again, here's another example of, here's a comparison. Look at the Urartian stonework compared to the finely cut megalithic stonework. They're not the same cultures. But this task is now not being done at all by archaeologists. It's left in the hands of people like Robert Everett Grant and myself and others who are trying to set the story straight. And there are archaeologists that are getting on board. We actually have an archaeologist on our team named Hans Orheim, and there are others who are joining forces to change this entire narrative right now. Now, this is a site called Ionis Kalesi that I believe will change all of history in the future. You've probably never heard of it. It was found in 1997 to 2001, depending on what part of the temple and the area that was excavated. And it is all built out of andesite. It's a very, very hard type of stone. Andesite and basalt are both igneous volcanic stones. Very, very, very hard and sophisticated. And when I show you some of the symbols, and we're going to follow this around the world, it might blow your mind. Okay, so here again, another example, if you didn't need enough of them already, of this base level of extremely fine andesite stonework with the very primitive Urartian mud brick above it. Now, the reason I want to bring up that how this site was found was that it was a giant hillside that had massively collapsed mud brick walls on top of it, and even sediment. And one of the things that we've been working with experts like Dr. Robert Schock and his wife Katie is this understanding and idea that sites like Göbekli Tepe were actually buried and sealed, and that this site had the very same thing happen because they were trying to protect something. Now, that means that the Urartian culture likely are the ones who buried and preserved it, so which gives me hope to think that parts of their society still highly valued these sites because they were, again, very a warlike culture. And this site, again, ended up being preserved all the way until nearly 2000, the year 2000, before it was found, which is very important because if it was found sooner, it might have been completely dismantled and destroyed and we would have lost all this. So thank God that this site was protected and preserved because what we have here may blow your mind. Here is the entryway to this temple. It's called a Susi temple, S-U-S-I. It's a very specific type of temple. And again, you can see the Urartian mud brick trying to mimic the finely crafted stonework beneath it. And as you walk in, these temples seem to embody an actual journey in themselves. The teachings of this culture are woven into the design of the temple. Okay. This slide is going to be pretty interesting to people. Now, in front of you, you have what is clearly a sun temple, just like the Coricancha, just like Saskatchewan above it. We have sun temples of the Inca. A lot of comparisons to that here. Now, very, very interesting designs. You can see one of the most important motifs in the ancient Greek culture became the griffin. And here you have the griffin as a protector of what looks like an hourglass. Now that to me represents time. And what we have in front of it is what became one of the most sacred holy crosses, arguably of all, that became the Knights Templar, or Red Cross. And that is right in front of you in what I believe was its very first iteration ever in history. And now we know, if you've seen, and we'll get into this as we go along in the cross and we'll go deeper, I have some slides showing this, but that cross became an incredibly important part of pre-Christian religions and secret societies and others. And Robert Edward Grant here definitely talks about the importance of this cross and others in our entire culture, in our history. Now, on the right side, you can see the god holding. He's also up at the top, kneeling down, basically passing 3 crosses. 3. Now, I want you to remember this concept of 3. It's going to be woven into nearly everything that we have. And it gets, again, this is where Robert Edward Grant and our work has so many parallels, because it gets into Da Vinci's work. Da Vinci with the Last Supper, with the 3 doorways, are going to get into this concept as we go along. Now, the next site I want to show you, and I'll show you why there's basically comparisons and how there's overlaps to these. But this is called Cavustepe. Very mysterious site on top of a mountain with these multi-ton basalt blocks scattered around the region, which have evidence of machine cuts, like we see in Egypt and in Peru. What completely does not look like hand tools, but part of a civilization that seemed to understand how to build things and obtain stone from enormous distances away. These basalt blocks came from a volcano called Mount Sufan. We have no idea how they quarried it, how they moved it, or how they brought it here. But again, this entire mountain that you see built here, just like Cavustepe, has no basalt at all. It's all limestone, which is very interesting if you consider the idea that the Great Pyramids of Giza were covered in limestone as an insulation material. Now, if it doesn't, to me, it can't be a coincidence that you have parts of this region that are literally volcanics are basalt, but they didn't build on them. They wanted to build on limestone. That gets into, I think, the very interesting concept of energetically trying to do something on the earth based on, ley lines, based on celestial components, and based on understanding this component of energy that we don't seem to understand today. Now here we are in the field, and unfortunately Robert Edward Grant was not able to join us on this scouting trip, but he will be coming with us when we go on the follow-up trip for this. Here we have Dr. Robert Schock on the left side. I'm sure some of you have heard of him. He's a very good geologist. And then you have archaeologist Hans Orheim in the center. And we are looking at these basalt blocks which appear to be melted. Melted. And we're able to confirm, Dr. Robert Schock was able to confirm that this melting is indeed what's called vitrification. Now the reason that's important is that vitrification can only happen at very key moments in Earth's history. It is not something that we've observed anywhere within the last 11,600 years. Based on ice core samples from Greenland and Antarctica, we can understand that vitrification only happens from these extreme events on Earth. And in order to melt stone, in this case this basalt melts into obsidian glass. In order to do that, you have to have temperatures in this spot that would have exceeded 2,000 degrees. And that can only happen from 2 possible types of events. A type of plasma coronal mass ejection event, or possibly an impact. But I'm leaning more towards the type of CME event that can create these plasma-like environments, which would be enough to wipe out an entire civilization. Here's some further evidence. You can actually see where the basalt has turned into obsidian glass on the surface. And again, this is evidence that we need help support and finally change the old historical narrative to understand that these lost civilizations were real and that they built all around the world and they all mysteriously disappeared. And that's what we're exploring now in this region. And we're going to come right back. We're going to be getting to Turkey and Bolivia here in a second. So this is that bas-relief that came from Kalesi, found in 1964, and was brought to that garden in the old Museum of Vaughan, and is sat there for 25 years. And that shows you, again, like I was pointing out, incredibly important teachings that we're about to get into. You can see the 3 triptych doorways there on the right. God wholly is passing the knowledge to the center of the tree of life with 3 sets of pillars. 3 sets of pillars with the 3 triptych doorways, and then the flowering in the center, like we saw in the Ashurbanipal Library, the 7 spokes of light at the top. And what I believe is that if you study this bas-relief, you basically can connect back to nearly every concept in ancient Hermeticism, ancient Egypt, and the great sages of knowledge that have been teaching us the different concepts of us and the idea of what we really are and who we are. And that these teachings, again, you're going to see all over Peru. And we'll get into that in a second as we go forward. So this buttress type of pillar design, I want you to remember, because we're going to see examples here as we go forward. But it's basically this type of energetic design that is very, very mysterious. It seemed to have sacred geometry components and designs with harmonic resonance and frequencies that we just don't seem to understand today. Now this hill right here in the back, we believe was artificially put there, because it was part of sealing off this entire site, just like Ionis, to preserve and protect it so that it could survive into the future. And you can imagine an ancient temple once stood here that opened up and faced the west for the setting sun, because these are sun temples, but it's no longer there. Because unfortunately, in the 1960s, it was dismantled, and the parts of it were mysteriously brought to different places. And we now just have the pieces of what's left behind. Okay, so we're going to now go over some worldwide connections to this, and we're going to expand on this. I just wanted to lay that out for all of you, that something mysterious happened in the Lake Fawn region with these giant megaliths and these ancient motifs and symbols. And we're going to get into how they connect all around the world. To start, here's Lake Fawn in comparison to Lake Titicaca. Now, they're both some of the deepest lakes on Earth. Lake Fawn is actually the 4th deepest lake on Earth. It's 1,500 feet deep. Now, Lake Titicaca is nearly 1,000 feet deep. Both surrounded by volcanoes. Both have a lot of comparisons. But as we go forward, what I believe we're seeing here is a sister civilization, basically mimicking each other on different parts of the world. And I think that the lakes themselves, with these depths down into the earth, had some kind of a very important connection to these cultures, with some kind of an energetic reason that we don't fully understand today. Okay, now we're going to get some comparisons to showing all this. Now, God Haldi has a lot of comparisons to Viracocha. The first thing you can see is Viracocha is holding 2 condors in each of his hand, which I believe represents this concept of balance, of holding balance of all things. Nature, balance, and harmony of everything. Now, if you look at Haldi, he also has pillars on each side of him, basically showing this concept of balance as well. It's the same thing echoed, but just in a slightly different way. Okay, now we're going to get into showing some of these examples. Now, here you can see the step pyramid design right here. You combine 2 step pyramids on top of each other, you get the Chicana. It's essentially the same thing that we have here. Now, the Chicana design is actually present on Ollantaytambo, right on the front of the megalithic blocks, and it's in many, many, many other places as well. And we'll be seeing that soon. But look what we have here. See the cross at Ionis? Right there. It became what was known as the Incan Sun Cross. And the Chicana is actually a form of the cross as well. But it's a step pyramid design form. We can see that those comparisons and parallels all together. Now, I'll explain what those mean in a second. Here we go again. This is where it gets wild. Because you start saying, oh my God, this is completely different parts of the world, and yet the same symbols and motifs are carried over. There, you can see the step pyramids, the 3 step pyramids with the inverted version above it, which again would create the Chicana if you just combine them. But here in Baño de la Newstead, Ollantaytambo, which we'll be going to, you see 3 levels, like 3 doorways, 3 levels with the exact same design, with a very, very important spring. It actually means spring of the Nusta. Now, the Nustas were these goddesses into the ancient Inca that were basically priestess, that were the highest level of the femininity here, basically a woman of the gods. And they have the spring flowing right over the very top of this, just like we see with the concept of these step pyramids being part of balance and harmony and fertility in all of nature. And so it's no coincidence to me that these are both showing that same design, but it means that we have a connected civilization here. We have knowledge passing around the world. Here's that Chicana symbol. Again, you see the same 1, 2, 3 levels with basically a connector in between. It represents what I believe is this idea as above, so below. Right? So we have this concept of the harmony of the all. It is the balance and harmony of the all. And this is the Pumapunku in Tiwanaku in Bolivia. And again, this Chicana symbol seems to be mimicked all over this region. But it comes from what I believe is originally the Lake Vaughan region. Okay, this is wild. I just added this slide last night because I just found this yesterday. And I was like blown away. I couldn't believe it because I had not known about this, despite the amount of things I've seen for the Coricancha. I didn't know. Look at this design right here. That design is from those buttress type of pillars we saw at Cavustepe Kalesi and Ionis. And again, they circle these Susi temples in a very mysterious sacred design that we don't understand still fully yet. Very mysterious. Now, I have it zoomed in there so you can see what it looks like from above. And there you go. In the Coricancha, we have the very same design. Carried over thousands and thousands of miles away is the very same design in what looks like some kind of an altar that we, again, don't really fully understand. Now, this is heavily eroded. This has been broken and fractured off. But you can imagine this once had finer cut sides to it. But again, the comparisons are very hard to ignore. You see the same extended periods with the type of design that mimics the same thing we see on these pillars. So I was like, wow. This totally blew my mind because I did not know about that. So that is now another connection that we'll be seeing on this trip. Okay, again, we're going to get back and I'm going to show you that same step pyramid design with the doorways, right? The 3 doors. And we'll get into what that means in a second. But here we go, Nampa and Glacier, which we're also going to as well, which is basically right across the valley from Ollantaytambo, is this unbelievably hard type of basalt material with the very same doorway, with the same 3 levels cut into this. Now, what was the purpose of this structure? Very mysterious. A lot of people believe it's some kind of a portal, like a gateway. And they sit right in that. You can actually sit in that. But there you have the concept of 3 doorways with the same step pyramid design with these types of knobs that are sticking out of it. And for the backstory, for people who don't know, the Spaniards, when they conquered the region, there was once a hole right here, a hole, energetic hole that they had created, and the Spaniards put a stick of dynamite inside that hole and blew up the top of this, which is really, really nice of them to do that. But that is why that entire top is broken off, because they blew it up. And we'll be seeing examples of this. Now, this concept of 3 doorways is very, very interesting because it gets into the Abrahamic religion concept of the Holy Trinity, right? There's 3 doorways. And now in spirituality, you would think of it as the mind, the body, and the spirit, or the soul, right? The Holy Spirit. And it represents these totalities that exist within us. That we are part of the whole, that we are part of the microcosm of the macrocosm of the entire universe, and that we are, like Robert Evergrande says, fractals of God or source itself. And that this journey here is that we start as spirit, and we come into the material world as a physical body that has a mind, and then we must do the full circle back to where we started to return to spirit. And I find it absolutely fascinating that the Last Supper of Da Vinci has the very same 3 doorways with the central door behind Jesus. exactly like Haldy's top of his hat, his head, is pointing directly to the middle doorway of the Holy Spirit. Now, if you look above it, there's a flowering of 7 spokes, 7 colors in the visible light spectrum.